yet another Roman emperor, Macrinus, is dead, assassinated, dying violently, not of natural causes. At the height of the Pax Romana, we not only had lengthy, long, sustained reigns of emperors who succeeded each other in a mostly ordered way. We're talking about the emperors that reigned from Trajan through Marcus Aurelius. But now, less than 50 years after Marcus's death, the seat of power in the empire is becoming like a game of musical chairs, and emperors simply cannot establish themselves before some usurper from outside or some issue internal to the regime triggers events that lead to coups, assassinations, and regime change. This was the case with Macrinus, it was the case with Caracalla before him, it was the case with Geta before him, same was true of Didius Julianus, Pertinax, and the same will be true today with Elagabalus. So let's get started with this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 69, Rome's Emperor of the Sun. Elagabalus is portrayed in the sources as a uniquely degenerate Roman emperor. As we saw last time, Elagabalus took over in an open civil war against the previous emperor, Macrinus, who had been the Praetorian prefect under the emperor Caracalla. Macrinus lost the loyalty of his troops, probably because Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's grandmother, used her wealth and influence in the Roman East to purchase the loyalty of Macrinus's soldiers. With just a few legions and a vague propaganda narrative about Elagabalus being a priest and favorite of the sun god, she was able to maneuver him into the position of emperor in 218 AD. He was only 14 years old. Many modern historians and also ancient ones suspect that Elagabalus was largely a figurehead. In reality, the Roman Empire at this point was ruled by some combination of Julia Maesa, Elagabalus's grandmother, and Elagabalus's mother, Julia Soaemias. And I realize that those names are a little bit of a mouthful, but you'll need to remember them. The first names are both Julia, so we have to remember them as Julia Maesa, the grandmother, and Julia Soaemias, the mother. I also mentioned in the last episode that a third rumor was circulating, likely started or encouraged by Elagabalus's mother and grandmother, that he was in fact the illegitimate son of Caracalla. And to give some weight to this rumor, when Elagabalus obtained the supreme power, he changed his name to Antoninus, which was the very same name that Caracalla had used as well. The name is a reference to the dynasty of Marcus Aurelius and the Antonine emperors. Of course, these emperors are related in no way whatsoever to those emperors, but these were desperate times, and establishing some form of continuity, even in a superficial way, was crucial for these emperors who could plainly see how difficult it had been for their predecessors to establish and hold power. Before the end of AD 218, Elagabalus made his way back to Rome. He'd been made emperor all the way in the east in Syria. Macrinus, the previous emperor, had never even visited Rome, so it was long past time for an emperor to make an appearance there. But before Elagabalus even arrived, he was already sending messages proclaiming the inauguration of a new religious era in the Roman Empire, that his god, El-Gabal, which is a cognate of the Eastern supreme deity Baal. This is the same god made famous in the Old Testament scriptures, an important figure in several Middle and Near Eastern cultures. Elagabalus proclaimed that this god was to be worshipped as the new Roman supreme deity, in a sense, replacing Jupiter. Now, syncretism the Romans could often tolerate. That is the practice of equating one regional god with a Roman god and saying that the regional god is a kind of manifestation or facet of the Roman god. And so worshiping the local god is really just the same as worshiping the Roman god. That's not necessarily as threatening as what Elagabalus was doing here, which was saying that El-Gabal was superior to Jupiter. And I think what was unsettling about this is here you have an emperor that has come into power at age 14 on the back of a coup, It was an unstable time politically with usurpations and supplantings. And here we have the same thing happening in the religious sphere. El-Gabal was supplanting Jupiter. It would not have been hard for any Roman, soldiers, senators, and citizens, to make a connection between divine disorder and temporal disorder. And so the zeal of this 14-year-old kid was already sowing the seeds of his undoing before he even made it to Rome. And if Romans were worried by what they were hearing as Elagabalus traveled to Rome, they would have become even more unsettled when they saw what Elagabalus did once he arrived in the city. His behavior seemed to confirm that here was a boy who lacked all self-control, had nothing of the traditional classical virtues of a Roman elite, and would rule in the same fashion as Nero or Caligula or Caracalla during the worst years of those emperors. What am I talking about? This is Cassius Dio's report on Elagabalus, and I've cut quite a lot out for time purposes, but you can get a sense of what he himself saw when Elagabalus came to Rome. Quote, "He showed affectations in his actions and in the quality of his voice. He used to dance, not only in the orchestra, but also in a way, even while walking, performing sacrifices, receiving salutations, or delivering a speech. He was bestowed in marriage and was termed wife, mistress, and queen. He painted his eyes, daubing them with white lead and alkanet. He had the hairs plucked out so as to look more like a woman. He carried his lewdness to such a point that he asked the physicians to contrive a woman's vagina in his body by means of an incision, promising them large sums for doing so." That's Cassius Dio in his Roman history. And like I said, Cassius Dio saw a lot of this with his own eyes. He lived through it. Cassius Dio had a living memory of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor. And within Cassius Dio's own lifetime, the behavior of emperors had degraded to the point where they were doing the sorts of things that Elagabalus was doing here. Strutting about Rome in makeup, embracing effeminacy to such an extent that a rumor, like the one that he mentions at the end of the passage, that Elagabalus wished to swap out his male private parts for female ones, could be believed and preserved in his writing without causing Cassius Dio to lose credibility. Elagabalus was married multiple times, mostly to women, but also to men. And you might recall way back in the early episodes of this podcast when we looked at the reign of Nero, that emperor had also been rumored to have had homosexual marriages. And I'll remind you now of what I mentioned back in that episode. The homosexuality itself was not the end of the world for the Romans. In fact, the overwhelming majority of the emperors during the Pax Romana engaged at one point or another in some form of homosexuality. Issue with both Nero and Elagabalus was that they openly embraced the passive role in those relationships. Cassius Dio talks about Elagabalus being bestowed in marriage and termed wife, mistress, and queen. The Romans may have tolerated aspects of homosexuality, but they did not tolerate elite men or emperors acting in such effeminate ways. And even the traditional marriages of Elagabalus were fraught with scandal. One of the women that he married was a Vestal virgin. Vestal virgins took a 30-year vow of celibacy. They were, in a religious sense, sisters to all Roman citizens, and were therefore required to refrain from all sexual activity until the end of their vow. It was part of their sacred duty to worship the goddess Vesta and to tend her sacred fire, which was a kind of barometer for the health and well-being of the city of Rome. Elagabalus does not seem to care about these traditions at all. While people were, of course, shocked with what Elagabalus was doing, they flooded the streets for his various spectacles and celebrations because he was also known to give away vast amounts of wealth, handing out food and coins, even gold and silver objects from the imperial palace, just tossing them out as he processed through the crowds. Elagabalus also engaged in construction projects, and normally the Romans love construction projects. And his was a temple, and normally the Romans love when their emperors build temples. These things make the gods well disposed towards Rome. They ensure that victories in Rome's wars are going to follow shortly thereafter. The gods love temples. But the temple that Elagabalus built was the El-Gabalium on the Palatine Hill, a temple to the god El-Gabal, which would house a large black rock that he took from Emesa, and that black stone was thought to be a kind of shell in which the god himself lived. The black rock was almost certainly a meteorite, and we actually have coins depicting Elagabalus with the name Antoninus on the one side and a chariot hauling the black stone into Rome on the other side. So this black rock from the east, housing an eastern god that was supposed to be superior to Jupiter, was placed in a temple on the Palatine where Augustus's temple of Apollo had been. Elagabalus's new temple would receive religious objects and relics from other Roman temples. Elagabalus seems to have had no interest in actually running the Roman state. I don't know that he really could have as such a young and inexperienced person. He maneuvered into positions of power actors and dancers and chariot drivers. These men were given positions that would normally be reserved for elites and senators. And although many citizens and soldiers would have liked how much money he was giving to them, at some point, at least the soldiers realized that the Roman Empire could not long endure an emperor as uniquely out of touch as Elagabalus appeared to be. It would not be hard to politically outmaneuver Elagabalus. Not only was he inattentive to the matters of government, he doesn't appear to have been a very savvy and smart person either. The person who worked to take him down was in fact the same person who had worked to lift him up in the first place, his grandmother, Julia Maesa. After only about 3 or 4 years of Elagabalus' chaotic regime in Rome, Julia Maesa decided to try again with a different grandson. His name was Alexander, and he was just 13 years old. And here's another similarity to Nero. Julia Maesa convinced Elagabalus to name Alexander as his heir, thus inserting Alexander into the line of succession. Evidently, she sold this move to Elagabalus by promising him that Alexander could begin to learn the aspects of real statecraft that were difficult for Elagabalus. This would free up Elagabalus to focus solely on the worship of El-Gabal, engaging in festivities and various other forms of licentious behavior. And Elagabalus was all for that. And so in 221 AD, the adoption was made official. Alexander was the son of one of Julia Maesa's other daughters, and she had raised her son with a classical, traditional, elite education in philosophy, rhetoric. She had been preparing him for a political career. And although it doesn't seem to be the case that Alexander did all that much, at least at this stage in his life, he certainly appeared to have far more promise than the current emperor Elagabalus. Eventually, both Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soemus, realized what was happening. They began to spread rumors that Alexander was unwell as a way to suggest that he would not be a healthy, long-lived emperor were he to ever actually take the throne. Some sources even claim that Elagabalus had sent assassins to Alexander, but Julia Maesa placed her own guards in Alexander's entourage, and these men could not be corrupted and successfully defended young Alexander from these attacks. In 222 AD, Alexander was made consul, but later Elagabalus revoked that consulship. It's clear that there were two distinct sides. The emperors were fighting, but that was really just a proxy war for the grandmother Julia Misa squabbling with her daughter Julia Soemus. The matter resolved itself in quite violent and spectacular fashion around the middle of 222 AD. The Praetorian Guard invited both boys, their grandmother and their mothers, into the Praetorian camp. Elagabalus entered the camp to a somewhat cold and muted reception. But when Alexander was brought into the camp, the Praetorians cheered loudly. And in an impulsive move that would lead to his death, Elagabalus became enraged at the Praetorians. He ordered the arrest of the men who were cheering. Of course, the Praetorians were not going to arrest themselves. Elagabalus fled the camp along with his mother, pursued by members of the Praetorian Guard. Eventually, both emperor and mother were caught and cut down in cold blood. It was technically a mutiny against the sitting emperor, but Julia Misa allowed it all to happen, no doubt disgusted with her first choice of emperor and prepared to sacrifice him and her own daughter so that she could start afresh with her grandson Alexander. The Roman Senate condemned the memory of Elagabalus. His name and his images were defaced or destroyed, and the Black Rock, worshipped as a god on the Palatine Hill in Rome, was sent back to the east. The empire was once again ruled by a young teenager. Would this new one, Alexander, be the answer to Rome's problems? As it turns out, Alexander would have one of the longer reigns of the 3rd century, and compared to the chaos both before him and after, the years he ruled appear to be a time of temporary peace, in an age in which peace was so hard to come by. Why did Alexander, a boy from the same family and of the same age of the previous failed emperor, manage to carve out a short reprieve from the growing crisis of the 3rd century? We'll talk about that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.